December 1944, on the Ardennes forest. The temperature has plummeted to a bone-chilling 2 degrees Fahrenheit. The snow here is no longer white. It is stained with the gray ash of relentless artillery fire and the frozen blood of American soldiers. In this desolate, heavily wooded sector near the Luxembourg border, a shattered company of American infantry is pinned down. They have been fighting continuously for 4 brutal days. They have no proper winter gear, they have no hot food. Their radios are dead, and they are completely cut off from reinforcements. Ahead of them, German machine gun fire is methodical, sweeping the tree line every 2 minutes like a mechanical scythe. Men are dying not just from shrapnel, but from the vicious cold that slowly stops their hearts as they lie wounded in the snow. This is the Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States in World War II. And the line is breaking. But the most chilling event unfolding in this frozen hellscape is not being executed by the enemy. It is happening 400 yards behind the American line, on a narrow, rutted supply trail just out of range of the German 88mm guns. A United States Army captain, the commanding officer specifically responsible for holding this fragile sector and the lives of the men bleeding in the snow, is standing next to a running jeep. His men are screaming for medics that will never come, waiting desperately for orders that will never be given. But the captain is not coordinating an artillery strike. He is not rallying a counterattack. He is quietly and frantically packing his personal duffel bag into the back of the vehicle. He has looked at the brutal math of the battlefield, calculated the odds of his own survival, and decided that the men holding the front line are already ghosts. He looks at his driver, a terrified 19-year-old corporal whose hands are shaking violently on the steering wheel, and orders him to turn the jeep around. They are heading west, away from the front, away from the dying. It is an act of calculated cowardice, a direct betrayal of the most sacred oath a commanding officer takes. In the absolute chaos of the massive German offensive, the captain believes no one will notice one missing officer. He believes he can slip away into the fog of war, write up a fabricated report later, and live to see the end of the war. He thinks he has escaped. He thinks the chaos will cover his tracks. But he is completely wrong, because coming up that exact same narrow, ice-slicked trail from the west, driving directly toward the sound of the guns, is an open-top command jeep. It is not moving cautiously. It is tearing through the snow with relentless purpose. On its bumper is the insignia of the United States Third Army. Inside sits a man who views cowardice not as a human weakness, but as a terminal disease that must be violently eradicated. General George S. Patton Jr. does not retreat. He does not halt, and he absolutely does not tolerate those who do. The 2 vehicles are about to meet head-on in the frozen woods. The engine of the retreating jeep revs, tires spinning on the ice as the driver tries to flee. Patton's vehicle lurches forward and stops, blocking the narrow road completely. The engine cuts off. The silence that falls over the trail is heavier and colder than the falling snow. The silence on that frozen trail was not the absence of sound, but the presence of absolute terror. The 19-year-old corporal behind the wheel of the retreating jeep froze, his foot slipping off the clutch. The engine stalled, sputtering into the bitter air before dying completely. The captain, sitting in the passenger seat with his duffel bag clutched to his chest, stared through the falling snow at the vehicle blocking his escape. He recognized the polished helmet first, then the gleaming stars on the collar. Finally, the legendary ivory-handled revolvers resting at the hips of the man slowly rising from the command jeep. It was General George S. Patton Jr. Patton did not yell. He did not issue a frantic radio call. He simply stepped out of his vehicle, his boots crunching heavily against the frozen mud, and began to walk toward the captain. Every step was deliberate, measured, and dripping with an unspoken menace. This was not a routine battlefield inspection. This was an executioner approaching the gallows. The captain, his face draining of whatever color the freezing wind had left, scrambled out of his seat. He stood at attention in the snow, his hand trembling so violently that his salute looked like a spasm. He was a man caught in the ultimate act of betrayal, standing before a commander who despised cowardice more than he despised the German army. Patton stopped 3 feet away. His eyes, cold and unblinking, scanned the packed duffel bag, the terrified driver, and finally the sweating captain. When Patton finally spoke, his voice was not a roar, but a low, dangerous growl that cut through the winter wind like a serrated blade. "Captain," Patton said, the single word carrying the weight of a death sentence, "where exactly do you think you are going?" Panic seized the captain's throat. He began to stammer, desperate to wrap his desertion in the language of military necessity. He blurted out fractured excuses about establishing a rear-guard command post, securing better communications, and pulling back to save his men from certain annihilation. It was a pathetic, transparent lie, a frantic attempt to justify abandoning his bleeding soldiers to save his own skin. Patton let him speak. He let the man dig his own grave with every cowardly syllable. The silence that followed the captain's excuses was suffocating. Patton stepped closer, leaning in until the captain could smell the stark, metallic scent of the general's sidearm. "You are a liar," Patton whispered, his voice vibrating with barely contained fury. "You are not establishing a command post. You are running. You are leaving American soldiers to die in the snow while you save your own miserable hide." The captain opened his mouth to protest, but the words died in his throat. Patton's hand moved smoothly, resting with terrifying intent on the ivory handle of his revolver. The message was unmistakable. The moral shock of the moment paralyzed everyone present. The captain had to make a choice, and he had exactly 3 seconds to make it before the general made it for him. The panic choking the captain finally broke, and he began to stammer, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. He desperately tried to wrap his desertion in the language of military necessity. He blurted out fractured excuses about establishing a rear-guard command post, securing better communication lines, and pulling back to a more defensible position to save his men from certain annihilation. It was a pathetic, transparent lie, a frantic, sweating attempt to justify abandoning his bleeding soldiers to save his own skin. Patton let him speak. He did not interrupt. He let the man dig his own grave with every cowardly syllable, watching him flounder under the weight of his own betrayal. The silence that followed the captain's excuses was suffocating. Patton stepped closer, leaning in until the captain could smell the stark, metallic scent of the general's sidearm and the harsh bite of his cigar smoke. "You are a liar," Patton whispered. His voice did not echo through the trees, but it vibrated with a barely contained, terrifying fury. "You are not establishing a command post. You are running. You are leaving American soldiers to die in the snow while you save your own miserable hide." The captain opened his mouth to protest, to offer one last desperate defense, but the words died in his throat. Patton's hand moved smoothly, resting with absolute, terrifying intent on the ivory handle of his revolver. The message was unmistakable, a brutal clarity that cut through the fog of war. The moral shock of the moment paralyzed everyone present. The 19-year-old driver stopped breathing. The captain stopped trembling. He had to make a choice, and he had exactly 3 seconds to make it before the general made it for him. "Get your gear out of this vehicle," Patton ordered, his voice flat and final. The captain hesitated for a fraction of a second, his mind struggling to process the ultimatum. "I said," Patton repeated, his grip tightening on the revolver, "get your gear out." The captain broke. He scrambled to the back of the jeep, his movements frantic and clumsy, pulling his heavy duffel bag into the snow. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. "Now," Patton said, looking the captain dead in the eye, his gaze piercing and merciless. "You are going to walk back to your men. You are going to take command of that line, and if you attempt to leave that position before you are ordered to do so by a superior officer." Patton paused, letting the absolute finality of his words sink in. "I will personally come back here and shoot you myself." The captain's hands moved frantically. He scrambled to the back of the jeep, his movements clumsy under the sheer, terrifying weight of Patton's gaze. He hauled his heavy, olive-drab duffel bag over the side, letting it drop into the snow with a dull, pathetic thud. It was the sound of a man's survival instinct colliding violently with an unyielding code of honor and losing. "Now," Patton said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the icy finality of a judge passing a death sentence. He looked the captain dead in the eye, his gaze piercing through the man's excuses, laying bare the cowardice underneath. "You are going to walk back to your men. You are going to take command of that line. And if you attempt to leave that position before you are ordered to do so by a superior officer—" Patton paused. He let the wind howl through the silence, letting the absolute severity of his words sink in. He tapped the ivory grip of his revolver with one gloved finger. "I will personally come back here and shoot you myself." It was not an empty threat. Every soldier in the Third Army knew it was not an empty threat. General Patton was not a man who issued warnings he did not intend to execute. The captain swallowed hard, his throat dry despite the freezing air. He looked at Patton, the embodiment of ruthless military discipline. Then he turned and looked down the rutted, ice-slick trail toward the east, toward the sound of the German 88mm shells tearing the forest apart, toward the steady, rhythmic slaughter of the machine guns. He bent down, leaving his duffel bag in the snow, and picked up his M1 Garand rifle. Without a word, he turned his back on safety and began the long, agonizing walk back toward the hell he had just desperately tried to escape. Patton watched him go, his expression unreadable. He did not move until the captain's figure was swallowed by the falling snow and the dark shadows of the Ardennes pines. Then Patton turned his attention to the 19-year-old corporal, still sitting rigidly behind the wheel of the retreating jeep. The boy looked absolutely terrified, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel, fully expecting to be dragged out and court-martialed on the spot. "Son," Patton said. His voice was suddenly surprisingly calm, the lethal edge completely gone. "Turn this vehicle around. Go back to your unit." The young corporal nodded frantically, tears of sheer relief and adrenaline freezing on his cheeks. "Tell them," Patton added, his voice rising just enough to cut through the wind, "the Third Army is coming." The captain broke. He scrambled to the back of the jeep, his movements frantic and clumsy, pulling his heavy duffel bag into the snow. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. "Now," Patton said, looking the captain dead in the eye, his gaze piercing and merciless. "You are going to walk back to your men. You are going to take command of that line. And if you attempt to leave that position before you are ordered to do so by a superior officer—" Patton paused, letting the absolute finality of his words sink in. "I will personally come back here and shoot you myself." It was not an empty threat. Every soldier in the Third Army knew it was not an empty threat. General Patton was not a man who issued warnings he did not intend to execute. The captain swallowed hard, his throat dry despite the freezing air. He looked at Patton, the embodiment of ruthless military discipline. Then he turned and looked down the rutted, ice-slick trail toward the east, toward the sound of the German 88mm shells tearing the forest apart, toward the steady, rhythmic slaughter of the machine guns. He bent down, leaving his duffel bag in the snow, and picked up his M1 Garand rifle. Without a word, he turned his back on safety and began the long, agonizing walk back toward the hell he had just desperately tried to escape. Patton watched him go, his expression unreadable. He did not move until the captain's figure was swallowed by the falling snow and the dark shadows of the Ardennes pines. Then Patton turned his attention to the 19-year-old corporal, still sitting rigidly behind the wheel of the retreating jeep. The boy looked absolutely terrified, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel, fully expecting to be dragged out and court-martialed on the spot. "Son," Patton said. His voice was suddenly surprisingly calm, the lethal edge completely gone. "Turn this vehicle around. Go back to your unit." The young corporal nodded frantically, tears of sheer relief and adrenaline freezing on his cheeks. "Tell them," Patton added, his voice rising just enough to cut through the wind, "the Third Army is coming." The young corporal nodded frantically, the tears on his face beginning to turn into ice as the sheer relief and adrenaline flooded his system. He threw the jeep into gear, the the tires finding purchase on the rutted trail, and began the terrifying but now purposeful drive back to his unit. Patton watched the vehicle disappear around a bend, then climbed slowly back into his own command car. "Drive," he told his driver, a hardened sergeant who had seen the general pull these stunts before. They pushed forward, the engine roaring as they moved closer to the front lines, closer to the very chaos that the captain had just tried to flee. What happened on that frozen trail took less than 4 minutes. It required no paperwork, no formal court-martial proceedings, and no bureaucratic red tape. But the sheer magnitude of what had just occurred sent a shockwave through the entire sector that was more powerful and far more effective than an artillery barrage. The story of what Patton did, of the moment absolute authority collided with abject cowardice, spread from foxhole to foxhole faster than a radio transmission. It passed from frozen lips to frozen ears, igniting a spark of raw, unyielding discipline in the hearts of men who thought they had nothing left to give. The message delivered by that single brutal encounter was unmistakable. There is no retreat. There is no surrender. You stand your ground or you answer to Patton. This was not a matter of a general enforcing a dusty, theoretical rule from a training manual. This was about the fundamental moral contract between an officer and the men he commands. An officer's life is never, under any circumstances, more valuable than the lives of his soldiers. When a commander breaks that contract, when he chooses his own survival over the lives of the men bleeding in the snow for him, he ceases to be an officer and becomes a traitor. Patton understood a harsh reality of combat that many academic tacticians ignored. Fear is contagious. It spreads like a virus, paralyzing units, breaking morale, and causing defensive lines to collapse. But courage, and the absolute refusal to yield, is also contagious. And sometimes, in the darkest, most desperate moments of a war, courage has to be violently enforced. The men of that shattered infantry company held their line. They held it against impossible odds, freezing and bleeding in the snow, fighting off wave after wave of German attacks because they knew their commander was back in the fight with them, and they knew he was there because George Patton had forced him to be. This wasn't merely about enforcing a dusty military regulation or establishing dominance for the sake of ego. For Patton, this confrontation struck at the very core of what it meant to lead men in battle. It was about the fundamental, unbreakable moral contract forged between a commanding officer and the soldiers entrusted to him. The terms of that contract are absolute. An officer's life is never, under any circumstances, more valuable than the lives of his soldiers. When a commander breaks that sacred contract, when he consciously decides to prioritize his own survival over the lives of the men bleeding and dying in the freezing snow for him, he instantly ceases to be an officer. In Patton's eyes, and in the harsh reality of war, that man becomes a traitor to his uniform and to his country. Patton understood a brutal psychological reality of combat that many academic tacticians and desk-bound generals preferred to ignore. Fear is highly contagious. It spreads through a unit like a virulent disease, paralyzing soldiers, breaking morale, and ultimately causing defensive lines to collapse completely. But courage, resilience, and the absolute refusal to yield are also contagious. And sometimes, in the darkest, most desperate, and bloody moments of a war, that courage has to be violently and decisively enforced from the top down. The men of that shattered infantry company held their position. They held it against mathematically impossible odds, freezing and bleeding in the snow, fighting off wave after relentless wave of German attacks. They fought with the desperation of doomed men, but they held the line because they knew their commanding officer was back in the fight with them. And they knew he was there, risking his life alongside them, only because General George Patton had forced him to do it at gunpoint. It is essential to recognize that the true measure of a military force is not found in the pristine pages of its tactical doctrine, nor in the sheer volume of its artillery shells, nor even in the calculated movements mapped out in grand command centers. The ultimate measure of an army is found in the dark, desperate, and terrifying moments when all those things break down, when the radios are dead, the ammunition is gone, the enemy is closing in, and survival seems like a mathematical impossibility. In those specific, harrowing moments, an army holds its ground, or it collapses completely, based entirely on one single factor: the character of the men holding the line and the moral authority of the officers leading them. The captain on that frozen trail in the Ardennes had failed that test of character. He had looked at the brutal reality of the German offensive and allowed his primal instinct for self-preservation to override his sworn duty. He had chosen flight over fight. He had chosen to abandon his bleeding men to save himself. But Patton, driven by an unyielding, almost terrifying sense of military honor, intervened. He did not intervene with an inspirational speech or a gentle reprimand. He intervened with the cold, hard steel of an ivory-handled revolver and an ultimatum that left no room for misinterpretation. "You will do your duty or you will die right here by my hand." This was not cruelty for the sake of cruelty. It was a brutal, necessary act of battlefield triage. Patton understood that cowardice is a cancer that destroys armies from the inside out. By forcing that captain to return to the front line, Patton amputated that cancer before it could spread. He forced a broken man to stand back up, to shoulder his rifle, and to lead the men who were relying on him to survive. The story of that confrontation, the general, the cowardly captain, the blocked trail, and the lethal threat became an instant legend within the Third Army. It was whispered in foxholes and debated around campfires, but it was not a story of tyranny, it was a story of ultimate accountability. It was a stark reminder that in Patton's army, leadership was a terrifying responsibility, and the cost of abandoning that responsibility was a bullet. The men who survived the Battle of the Bulge, the men who fought through the snow and the mud and the blood, carried that story with them. They carried it because it confirmed something they desperately needed to believe: that their lives mattered, that their sacrifices were recognized, and that the men ordering them into the fire would be held to the exact same brutal standard. To fully comprehend the sheer psychological weight of Patton's confrontation with that captain on a frozen trail in the Ardennes, one must strip away the sanitized post-war mythology of the Battle of the Bulge. Forget the maps with neat red and blue arrows. Forget the sterile historical accounts of division-level maneuvers. The reality of December 1944 was not neat. It was a chaotic, blood-soaked nightmare of freezing mud, shattering shrapnel, and overwhelming terror. The American soldiers holding that fragile perimeter were not unfeeling machines. They were terrified young men, many of them barely out of high school, fighting in summer boots and inadequate coats as temperatures plummeted below zero. They were watching their friends die in horrific ways, their bodies torn apart by German artillery and preserved perfectly in the freezing snow. They were exhausted, they were desperate, and they were looking desperately for a reason, any reason, to hold their ground. The most critical element keeping those men in their foxholes was not ammunition, and it was certainly not warm food. It was leadership. It was the fundamental belief that the officers commanding them were sharing their risk, sharing their cold, and sharing their fate. When that captain threw his duffel bag into his jeep and ordered his driver to retreat, he wasn't just abandoning a physical location on a map. He was detonating a psychological bomb in the middle of his own unit. He was validating their deepest, darkest fears. "We are going to die here, and even our commander knows it. The situation is hopeless. Run." Had that captain successfully fled, the panic would have metastasized instantly. Platoon leaders would have seen their company commander bolt. Squad leaders would have seen their lieutenants falter. The enlisted men, already pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance, would have broken. A tactical retreat would have instantly morphed into a catastrophic rout, leaving a gaping hole in the American defensive line for the German offensive to pour through. General George S. Patton Jr. arrived precisely at the moment that psychological bomb was about to explode. He did not arrive with a comforting word or a strategic reassessment. He arrived as the ultimate unforgiving manifestation of military discipline. He diagnosed the deadly infection of cowardice instantly and applied the only remedy that works in the heat of combat: a fear far greater and far more immediate than the fear of the enemy. By forcing the captain to retrieve his gear from the snow, pick up his rifle, and walk back into the meat grinder of the front line, Patton did not just save a defensive position. He restored the shattered moral architecture of that entire infantry company. He demonstrated to every freezing, terrified soldier in that sector that the code of honor was not a suggestion. It was an absolute law, enforced from the top down with the threat of lethal violence. The captain walked back to the front line, not as a hero, but as a prisoner of his own duty, shackled by Patton's terrifying ultimatum. But to the men bleeding in the snow, his return was a visceral sign that the chain of command was intact. They held their ground, the line did not break, and the Third Army rolled on. Decades later, long after the snows of the Ardennes had melted and the blood had washed away from the frozen mud, the true legacy of that brutal confrontation on the supply trail remained. The captain, the man who had packed his duffel bag and ordered his driver to turn around, never spoke publicly about what happened that day. He returned to civilian life, carried on with his career, and grew old in the quiet comfort of a country he had almost betrayed. But he knew with chilling certainty that the only reason he did not live out his days as a disgraced coward or die in the snow from a general's bullet was because George S. Patton had refused to let him run. The men of that shattered infantry company never forgot it either. Many of them did not survive the Battle of the Bulge. They died in the freezing forests, holding the line against the desperate German offensive, but they died with their boots facing the enemy, and they died knowing that they had not been abandoned by their command. They knew that in the United States Third Army, rank was not a shield to hide behind. It was a heavy, terrifying burden that demanded the ultimate sacrifice. Patton did not seek to be loved by his officers. He did not care about being understood by historians who would later critique his harsh methods from the comfort of warm, safe offices. He cared entirely about winning the war and ensuring that the men who bled in the mud were led by officers who deserved them. That is the true, unfiltered reality of military honor. It is not always found in glorious charges or shining medals. Sometimes it is found in the darkest, most terrifying moments of human weakness, when a man is completely broken by fear, and someone with absolute, unyielding authority steps into his path and forces him to find his courage. The legend of the captain and the ivory-handled revolver is not just a story about fear. It is a profound lesson in ultimate accountability. It proves that an institution is only as strong as its willingness to enforce its highest standards in its darkest hours. Patton drew a line in the frozen earth of the Ardennes, and in doing so, he saved a company, he saved a battle, and he forced a terrified man to earn the uniform he wore.